Hello, this is Conviction Without Chaos, and it's another safe place discussion video. I'm still a little sick, so you're still going to hear some congestion in my voice. Again, the series is me presenting, thoughts and information that I've collected about any particular topic over a period of time. It's not me trying to convince you that I'm right and you're wrong about anything by any means. It's more about me explaining why somebody like me might think the way I do about any particular thing, and it's supposed to spark discussion. So today's topic is something I've been wondering about for a while, and it really stems from the question, why is public discourse so volatile in America, and why does it keep seeming to get worse? And of course there's a lot of reasons for this. This is really just one thing that's particularly on my mind in relation to that, and it's the question of whether or not America has lost some of its culture. Now, what do I mean by that? I don't mean that, Americans have lost their love of football and beer. That's a stereotype, but you know what I mean. I think that what's actually happening potentially is that many of the bedrock principles that once united Americans, ideas that were supposed to transcend party or identity, have become these battlegrounds. And that, this foundation of what it means to be American, it hasn't just shifted, it's fractured into multiple groups, at least two at any given time. So what is culture? It's not just music and food and holidays and language. That's certainly a part of it. But culture is this invisible agreement, in my view anyway, the shared values, beliefs, and behaviors that help people understand who they are and how they fit into society and what their country means. In many nations, culture is deeply tied into shared political beliefs. It's by far not an agreement on every issue by everybody. It's more of a common sense of civic identity. It's something that says, this is what we as a nation stand for. So what principles am I talking about that I think are fracturing? Well, let's start with freedom of speech. And that First Amendment has always been a defining value for Americans. The belief that people should be able to speak freely, even if their views are unpopular or even if they're offensive. It's been a shield for activists and everyday citizens for over 2 centuries. But now, freedom of speech, it isn't just a principle, it's a political fight. So for example, on college campuses, you have some that argue that offensive speech is harmful and it needs to be limited. But you have this whole other group that says, well, limiting free speech, even with good intentions, erodes the very idea of free expression. And look at social media platforms. Some are being accused of censorship, and others are being accused of allowing hate speech. Politicians are passing laws to either regulate or defend online speech, but it seems to be dependent on who's doing the talking. Book bans in school libraries are being challenged by both the left and the right, and each are accusing each other of silencing ideas. Everyone says that they believe in free speech, but more and more it seems to be only when it's protecting their side. Another principle is the rule of law. Again, so simple, right? It's no one's above the law, not a president, no protesters, and not police. It's this shared moral baseline. But again, nowadays, is it more about who you're talking about? Look at President Donald Trump's indictments. On one side, you either see justice in action, or on the other side, you see political persecution. It depends on which media outlet you're watching. You have progressive prosecutors being praised for reform or being blamed for rising crime rates. And you have police that are either enforcing order or enabling abuse. It depends on which footage you're looking at. Even reactions to national events. Take a look at January 6th, 2021. the storming of the U.S. Capitol. Most Americans, or at least many, have seen it as a unprecedented attack on democracy, with, thousands of people charged and dozens convicted of serious felonies. But you have these other circles where it's viewed as politicized law enforcement, with some Republicans arguing even that the justice system is being used to punish dissent, not just crime. Compare that to the George Floyd protests in 2020, which came about after George Floyd's death at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer. For many Americans, these protests were a long overdue reckoning with systemic racism and police brutality. And I read that millions of Americans are estimated to have participated in these protests, and it's some of the largest protests in U.S. history. But others are remembering the violence and the looting, and they mention the millions and millions of dollars of damages across several cities and thousands of arrests. Critics ask why some of the riots were labeled as mostly peaceful, while others condemned them outright. And I am not going to comment on how I feel about any of these issues and where I stand on any of these sides for this video, because that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is look at the difference between each side. It's not a small disagreement. Look at the language. You get insurrection versus protest. You get peaceful demonstration versus mob violence. It's like you've got two groups of people sitting in a movie theater watching two different movies while the same thing's playing on the screen. It isn't a divide just about facts. It's a divide about worldviews, about which threats people think matter most and who they trust them to tell them the truth. And for our next principle, we've got checks and balances. In democracies across the world, checks and balances are put in place to make it hard for any one person or party to dominate. In democracies, you do need to worry about the tyranny of the majority. So what was once used to safeguard, this thing in America is sometimes now used, this is a strong word, but for sabotage. Right? You see government shutdowns, debt ceiling standoffs, and endless investigations. And it doesn't just seem like they're being used in normal cases. It seems like they're almost strategy. And you've got the Supreme Court, which is seen less as a neutral body nowadays, and it's seen as more of a political arm for whichever party, has dominated the appointee, has dominated picking who is in those seats. And you've got Congress rarely able to pass major legislation without some kind of crisis, and you've got presidents relying more on executive orders to get things done. And then we have democratic participation, so voting, right? And this stems from the idea that, elections are going to reflect the will of the people. But in today's America, that faith is fading. You've got millions of Americans believe that the 2020 election was stolen, even though there's no evidence to that. And you have others worrying about new laws that could actually make it harder for them to vote. And you have each side accusing the other of cheating and rigging and manipulating the process. No matter where you stand on that, what the result of it is that many Americans now believe that that system is rigged, and it doesn't matter which side wins. So without that shared trust in the voting process, democracy becomes a zero-sum game. And finally, equal protection under the law, which guarantees that no one's going to be treated differently based on your race or your gender or your background It's that foundation for civil rights, women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights, and more. But today, that word equality, even just the word, sparks division. I mean, you say DEI in a pub or a bar or whatever, and you could start a fight. It's very hostile, and you have some seeing different policies being put in place as justice, and others seeing it being put in place as an unfair advantage, regardless of what any policies are actually saying or doing. Let's look at trans rights. Some believe that that's the next frontier of civil rights. Well, you have others looking at that and seeing, danger towards their children and erasing their identity. So what happens when, these core values that once bound a nation together no longer unites them? What happens when culture doesn't collapse all at once? This is happening, I think, slowly, principle by principle. And it's the reason why it's gotten so far, is it hasn't been so in your face. And that's what culture really is. It's not what we eat or what we wear. It's what we believe together. Just to really corn dog that up. So right now, I just think the summary of that is that Americans believe very different things about what their country is, what it was, and what it should be. And I was going to leave it there, but then I thought I should probably present something about, maybe a way forward. And I do think there's a lot of things that need to be done, and maybe the future is something different altogether for America. But there is something unique about America that I don't think many Americans appreciate, but if you have anybody from outside looking in, this is something that will come up often. And I guess this is technically my take, and I'm still thinking about it. There's still a lot to think about here. But I'm curious if, for many Americans, are they at the point where their political identity has overtaken their national identity? Because people aren't just saying, I vote Republican, or I lean Democrat. They're saying, I am a Republican, or I am a Democrat. And when you say it like that, you're saying that that's not just a voting preference, that's a core piece of your identity. And when political labels become personal labels, you're now walking into tribalism, right? Because it becomes less about debating ideas and more about defending your team. So facts in these cases get filtered through this lens of, well, what helps my side? And the shift is eroding the sense of that shared American story. Let me show a count here of the last election. You've got 76 million folks voting for one side and 78 voting for the other. And now take a look at the screen and take a look at those parties. Tell me something that overlaps in terms of shared values. Tell me 5 things. How hard is that? I think it's very difficult. And that overlapping value set is what I'm talking about. That's your culture. And if you can't all agree on something, then you're only on different teams, right? So if you start with this belief that the other side isn't just wrong, but the other side is dangerous or evil or un-American, then you can't have a compromised middle ground, because any compromise becomes betrayal. And common ground just becomes impossible. So what's the result? You stop trusting institutions. You stop believing in facts, not because they're false, maybe, but because they're reported by the other side, right? And you stop seeing each other as fellow citizens. That's not democracy. And it doesn't mean anybody needs to give up their convictions. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about maybe it's time to reclaim your identity as American first and any partisan thing second. Because without that shared ground, without that culture, you're not debating a future. You're just trying to burn each other's house down. And on that very positive note, I want to thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, and again, on these videos, I don't open the comment section because I would rather know that folks are going out and having a discussion, something meaningful. Have a great day.